name is Sunil Rajaraman. Happy to be here at the film festival. I'm the co-founder of a company called Script.com. We're like Google Documents for screenplays, but we also crowdsource screenplays for the entertainment industry. So we've worked with Spike TV, Ed Burns, a producer, and Steven D'Souza, who wrote Die Hard and 48 Hours.
Hello, everyone. I'm Saad. So my day job is I write checks for entrepreneurs and startups based up in San Francisco. I'm at a firm called CMEA Capital. I run all of our seed investment programs. And my mandate is almost entirely around web, digital media, internet stuff. So that's my first hat. The other hat that I also wear with some nights and weekends is I was a co-founder of something called the Film Angels a few years back, which is an angel network that invests in independent film. I also am involved with a couple of things at the Stanford Design School, involved in teaching some classes at the UC Berkeley Business School. This is how I make up for all the damage that I do with my day job. Excited to talk about whatever you'd like to talk about, certainly hear from you guys. I'm curious, has anyone watched any of the films since we've been here? Were you guys fans? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Well, I don't know. What did you see? So Day in the Life was good?
It's amazing, the globalization idea of taking all this different content from all different kinds of people and throwing it on one platform and having one director kind of shift the mood all the way through the film.
I think that was a resounding yes. Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah, so I think I'll ask several questions to Saad, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. But how many of you are independent filmmakers? Okay, and how many of you are looking for money to fund a film? Okay. So actually, I just want to start right there, which is the financing market for independent film has basically dried up over the last few years, and here you are starting a group that invests in independent film. Can you first talk about what's happened to the finance market for independent film? And second, what was your motivation behind starting Film Angels?
So first of all, I should be clear. So I helped co-found Film Angels. There's a guy named Thomas Strenker who runs it full time, and he's an awesome dude. It's hard for me to sort of talk about what's happened in the industry over years. Here's what happened when I saw it. My day job was investing in startups, and I thought the venture industry was a mess in terms of how funding got done, how opaque it was, how entrepreneurs didn't have a lot of information. And then I met some filmmakers, and I realized that industry was probably 20 or 30 years behind even the institutions that we had with startups. So I was horrified at what was going on in this industry. Pretty much if you weren't doing something in a studio context, the way you would raise money was by going to people's homes and pitching them in their living rooms and then flying to Phoenix and doing it again. And it was awful as far as I was concerned. So the thought behind the Film Angels was, hey, look, on one hand, we're in Palo Alto. We're in the middle of Silicon Valley. We see how these things work. We've seen how all these institutions have developed over time. Why not try to bring the same discipline that we have on the tech side, which, again, I didn't think was actually that ambitious, to the film side? So that was the thinking behind Film Angels. And so the net result of it was, a loose collection of individual angel investors who all have an interest in investing in film, many of whom have come out of the tech industry or have made money in a bunch of different contexts, maybe in the film industry as well, and now want sort of a shared umbrella to do diligence and to write checks and probably a support group as well. So that's effectively what the Film Angels was, and that started a few years ago. And that's kind of what the intent is. I think the whole idea is the value proposition from a filmmaker's perspective is go to one place, meet lots of people at the same time, hopefully get checks in aggregate.
So tell us how you evaluate a film before you invest. What are the main criteria? What kind of things do you look for? Cast, locked in, distribution locked in.
Yeah, so in general, I think even on the tech side, this applies. I came to the conclusion years ago that when we used to talk about tech investing, people talk about startups, they talk about markets, they talk about product, they talk about financials. And in all the things that I did and all the ways that I lost money, what I realized was when things used to go good, the one thing they all had in common was awesome people, hands down. So now when I think of the tech world, and I think the same way when I think of the film world, it's kind of the awesome person bar, right? That's really what, if you look at everything else in the context of a startup or even in a film, a lot of stuff is commodity. If you can do it, other people can do it. In the software world, certainly that's true. The only thing that matters when it's not ideas, because the ideas constantly change, is people and who the execution team there is. And so as I look at film, it's the exact same model. So the criteria there tend to be people who've shown something extraordinary in their backgrounds, either in terms of stuff that they've done in the context of film, or if everyone's for people who are first timers, is to think about it from the perspective of how have you been exemplary in something that you've done, whether it's commercial production, whether it's something else. And then in terms of stage, which you alluded to in terms of cast lockdown, that sort of thing, from our perspective, we've seen things across the board. So I've looked at stuff, and we've done stuff at the Film Angels where all it was missing was someone under budgeted for finishing funds and for audio, to I just have a script and I'm thinking about what I want to do next. The one thing that we do ask, though, everybody is to think about their film exactly the way we think about startups, which is, in the absence of actually having any traction of any sorts, how do you have the discipline to look at the markets, to think about all the different things that go into your film as a business, and really convincing other smart people, especially for people who are first-time filmmakers, to get them on board, to sort of augment the holes in your experience. And what I always tell people in the startup world too is, short of actually having traction, the one biggest proxy you can bring is convincing other smart people from that industry to come join you. And I think it's the same in the film world too. So even in the case when you're not the sort of experienced person as a founder, as a filmmaker, bringing the right sorts of people on board to augment you, to fill in the gaps, to make sure that you're making new mistakes and not old mistakes. I think those are all important.
So one thing that is talked about a lot, especially here in the Valley, is distribution. And I wanted to see if you could give us any insight on the economics behind distribution. So say I have the content, it's finished, and I decide I want to go to Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, and other places to distribute. How would I do that, and what do the economics look like for me as a filmmaker?
So I don't want to be flippant, but the economics typically look like your next best alternative, right? And again, it's the same thing. If you're going for venture financing, it's the same thing. What's the valuation question? Well, honestly, most of the time, valuation looks something like this. And it's, what is your other option? And that's, by the way, it's exactly the same for venture financing rounds. I'm sure you've experienced this too. It's, so from that perspective, I think it's very similar. In terms of distribution, I think there's a lot of traditional forms of distribution that people certainly are well aware of. The stuff that actually has me most excited today, actually more than whether it's going to the festival circuit or Netflix or Hulu, et cetera, is what you can do online and what you can do for free. I think about Facebook as a context. 700 million people. It is now the biggest. It's the ultimate customer acquisition and distribution channel. It's the best way to get butts in seats. And I think it's just one of those things that everyone needs to get really smart about soon, if they're not smart about already. And I've seen some people do it, folks like Paranormal Activity, folks like Snakes on a Plane, and do it extremely well. And I think the good news is, for a filmmaker today, I think you have actually more options than just what's the traditional forms that were given to you. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine was actually, he actually was at Groupon a long time back. It's a company called The Point. He left The Point. He started a new curated platform for distribution for films called Prescreen. Just launched a couple weeks ago. And the idea is, how do we leverage digital distribution, the stuff that like the guilt groups of the world are really good at doing, whether it's email, Groupon, et cetera, and apply it to the world of theatrical film distribution as a way to get filmmakers real knowledge and data about the kinds of people who are likely to be good buyers for them. So the good news is I think the world is actually far wider than it ever has been before. And regardless of what screen you're talking about, whether it's on the PC, whether it's on your set-top box, your phone, I think digital and especially social mean a lot for what's possible. And I think is another way to create that alternative to create more liquidity and give you momentum when you go into the conversations with the traditional guys.
So, on the subject, what companies have you seen around here in the Bay Area that are kind of at the intersection of tech and media that are doing some interesting stuff with either distribution or content creation?
So certainly, I mentioned one called Prescreen, which launched a couple weeks back. I think it's relatively new in terms of that platform. And I haven't seen a ton at the sort of intersection of distribution, but I guess when I kind of look at every company that's out there, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, has effectively laid infrastructure down that I think is ripe to be used for these purposes. And I think, the good news is that 700 million people on Facebook just got connected for the first time. Now the big question is, now what? What do we do with that? And for that part, I think it's still very much the Wild West here. I don't know that I've seen any mature plans at the intersection of those things, but I fully expect to because, give you a quick example. Look what happened at Facebook last week. They had their F8 conference. Reed Hastings, who's on the board of Netflix, is on the board of Facebook. They announced being able to actually watch films in the context of directly in the Facebook experience. I know Warner Brothers, for instance, had already been doing rentals. I think The Dark Knight you could actually get on Facebook as well. There are a number of companies. There's a company called Million Eye, actually, that leverages commerce in the context of some of these things, who was powering some of these the film watching in the context of Facebook. There's other companies like Involver who've actually helped people like Alicia Keys put out her music for the first time in that context. So there's the beginnings of stuff here, but I think it's still very much the Wild West. The good news about that is, today more than ever, there are no rules when it comes to these things. We're inventing the rules as we're going along. And that's exciting. It's also scary. But as far as I'm concerned, if you don't do it, you're at a disadvantage. I think that's what the new world is going to look like in that context.
So one thing that you talked about, the very first question was, there is a lot of money up here. There's a lot of Google money, a lot of Facebook money, et cetera, et cetera. Why hasn't the Valley gotten into the content creation business? And if you think about it, relatively speaking, right? So an episode of Mad Men costs $2.5 million to produce. Friday Night Lights, $2 million. For less than 1% of its cash position, Yahoo could produce an entire season of Mad Men. Why don't they do that?
Well, Yahoo's tried, right? Yahoo's tried in a couple of different contexts, and I suspect people here know how that went. The funny thing about the Valley is, we're very biased, right? We're effectively a group of people whose foundational core talents tend to be things like engineering and science. So when we talk about content in the Valley, it's like this thing that just naturally, magically happens, right? Oh yeah, well, it's content. Content is a commodity business. You hear that a lot. When you talk about content business in the Valley, what you're really talking about are usually the pipes, right? It's usually distribution, enabling tech, that sort of thing. Everyone kind of hand waves for everything else. And I think the reason is that a lot of what you guys do in this audience is art, right? It's really, really, it's hard. As you guys know, it can be very expensive. But at the end of the day, there's no sort of science or IP that people can, maybe with the exception of things like Avatar, that people can point to say, this is why I think that one is going to win. And the Valley is really bad at judging and valuing that. And I think that's a big part of the challenge that we face here. Now, the good news is I think those worlds are coming together a lot. I actually see a ton of analogies just because I happen to sit on both sides, right? You look at what's happening, certainly in the cost of digital distribution, what that means in terms of the cost of production for things. I look at the same analogies actually in terms of the cost of startups in the Valley too. For a lot of the same dynamics, Moore's Law, other things are actually making it so that you can take a film from here and actually have it not be horrific. Those are real possibilities that are being created. And I actually think those worlds are going to collide in a bigger way. It's also fun for me to watch a lot of Hollywood personalities, especially in the context of Twitter now, becoming effectively distribution for a lot of tech companies. And I think you're going to see a lot more of it.
So talk to us a little bit more about the Film Angels. How many movies have you funded so far? What are your plans for the Film Angels going forward?
So the Film Angels has been around for a few years now. I think so we haven't actually disclosed a lot of the number of films and which films specifically that have been funded. Partly because some of the angels and the filmmakers don't necessarily want to do it. But I can tell you, there's probably been at least 15 or 20 films that have been financed in the last couple years from that platform. At the end of the day, we are an umbrella. There's a lot of angels and individuals who are making their own investment decisions. So in addition to sort of the formal structure of the Film Angels, you also have lots of people who are making, who are actually doing deals on the side, which I think is all good, just making that ecosystem come together. In terms of plans, I think we're a little bit at a crossroads. We're thinking about what comes next. We've never advertised or talked about it publicly. I think it's just been sort of like I said, a support group for people who want to lose money in many new ways. But again, when I look at what's happening in the film world and sort of how that hasn't advanced, it feels like there should be a very big opportunity. And more than anything else, a vehicle to actually get really good content and good films done. We've actually had things that are not just straight up films come through as well. It's, a lot of stuff in the animation world, a lot of stuff actually in the television world, some things that have been even slates that have come through. And increasingly some tech companies that are starting to be in the content business. But I'd love to talk to people here about what their ideas are for stuff like this. I think there's an opportunity to expand, and we're looking at all of them very carefully right now.
So if I'm a filmmaker and I want to get in front of the Film Angels, what is that process like? How does the vetting happen, or how would I go about doing that?
Yeah, so the format tends to be, usually somebody, say for instance, you drop me an email afterwards, effectively sponsors a project, and then on a monthly basis we have effectively a vetting meeting, right? So where that filmmaker has a chance to meet a subset of the people in the Angel Network as a way to just both start to socialize the project and also get interest. And then on a quarterly basis, usually we'll have a much bigger event with many more of the members come together in one place and usually pick maybe 5 of the projects that we've seen over the last quarter and give them a really big audience. In addition, I think there's a lot of stuff that happens behind the scenes in terms of socializing people, individuals who we think would be interested. There's actually a big email list that we have too that effectively is a way for us to get interest around any one particular project. So things are always coming in at that time, and that's kind of the cadence and the structure. But I'd love to tell you there was more structure than that.
Got it. Well, I want to open it up to the audience, so I'm sure they're eager to ask you some questions. So feel free to raise your hand.
So, are there particular genres that you feel are more successful than others?
The question is, are there particular genres that you feel are more successful than others?
There tends to be conventional wisdom about different genres. So, for instance, horror films tend to be things that can be relatively small budget, don't need to have big name talent, and yet, every summer there's kids who are willing to go out and watch those films. I can tell you that from our perspective, we see things across the board. We don't really have a strong bias in terms of a genre. We see a lot of international films for that matter too. And I think, frankly, for film, a lot of the things also come down to a personal connection with the people, between the content and the actual people who are writing checks. Because as you know, there's lots of incentives for people to want to get involved, but I feel like content in particular is one of those things where you kind of fall in love with it, or you fall in love with the project, and that's a big part of some of those decisions that get made.
Question is, if a film gets funded, what percentage do the Film Angels take?
Again, it's totally dependent on the individual that you're talking to, so it's hard to generalize. One thing I will say, what's been really interesting for me to watch, again, a contrast between what happens in the film world and the tech world. In the tech world, we have this notion of like staged investing, right? That sort of at a seed level, the valuation tends to be lower than it does at sort of a later point when the film's almost in the can, and now we're just looking to close up some things. What's been interesting. For me, is in the film world, that doesn't really exist in the same context. You don't really have the equivalent of Series A, Series B, Series C. You sort of have, one price that's negotiated up front, and then everyone, even later on, kind of piles on at that same price with sort of the equivalent of a preference, so last in, first out kind of rights. That's something that we've actually talked about a lot, and we're trying to change the structure of that because we think there is an opportunity to create staging. We want to reward people who get involved early, and we want to make sure that if I'm investing in something that is just about is pretty much done and we just under budget on audio, we shouldn't be asking the filmmaker to give up as much as we would if it was just a script with no condition, with no cast attached, and we're all working together. So. But again, as I've seen, a lot of these deals tend to look like, the equivalent of 120% back to your to the investors first, and then 50-50 split with the producers. I mean, that's sort of the standard thing that I hear all the time. But to me, it just feels like there's a lot of nuance there and a lot of staging there that doesn't get accounted for. And so we're trying to create those accounting mechanisms.
Question is, what kind of relationship do you have with screenwriters, if any?
I mean, we have some informal ties, but I suspect you probably have a great, some more context on this, right? I mean, I don't know that we have any institutional ties. We're trying to create some of those, relationships in a deeper way. But I'd be curious. I think folks like you probably have a great relationship, right?
Yeah, I mean, the screenwriter still remains, unfortunately. Gets the bad end of the deal most of the time, whether you're talking about independent films or studio films, and unfortunately the same holds true today. I wish I could say something better and more positive, but that's quite honestly the truth. The relationship between the investor and the filmmaker is primarily with the producer or director. The screenwriter is not even connected to the process. I wouldn't expect a screenwriter to be connected to the financing process, unless they're a screenwriter / director, right. like say an Ed Burns, who controls the financing as well.
Maybe we should do a deal with Script.
Well, we have plenty of screenplays for you.
There we go. Yeah.
So the question is, what percentage of the budget will Film Angels or another financier fund typically?
I think the short answer is no. We don't have a roof. Obviously, there's other ways to create leverage in your financing structure aside from just funding the production budget, but I don't know that we have a hard and fast rule on that front. Yeah, usually the producer-director relationship is structured before we get involved, so there's that's already happened, and there's been some kind of an agreement, and we don't typically get involved in.
Have you guys thought about, I don't know if you're familiar with the European system, that usually fund our films through different film funds from different countries, or sometimes from different regions. Has there ever been a discussion here? I know that there's different tax shelters from every city and now any state in America, but have you heard any kind of discussion that there would be a cooperation where you would do a cooperation with funding to make sure that there is a film, but they might distribute the risk?
I know so the question was, is there cooperation amongst the very many different bodies with different incentives from a financing perspective? I think the short answer is usually our filmmakers are taking advantage of all those things. We're not typically involved from that perspective. Often we'll know about a tax credit if you film if you actually do your film in Canada versus in San Francisco. Yeah, that kind of knowledge gets layered into that, but it's sometimes we're involved with the syndication, but usually the filmmakers are hustling to get the most out of their dollars from that perspective.
And then, sorry, there's the last question. Are you really strict on your auditing?
Actually, having auditing is nice. I can tell you, sort of the creative accounting that I've seen in the context of film financing is horrifying and scary. And as I'm sure many people know, And a lot of investors can tell you sort of horror stories about how the film grossed this massive number and yet somehow it was not profitable according to the creative accounting. That's something that I know is a concern for a lot of people. And I've actually seen some startups who are focused on providing some of that visibility through it and even the payment mechanisms to make sure that people are paid according to the business rules that they agreed to. But we could use certainly more of it, I can tell you that.
How hands-on are you guys with the projects that you fund, and what are some of the different ways that you guys get involved in different projects from actually like a creative standpoint, or do you just kind of say, hey, we're going to give you the money, and you guys are going to just run with your beast?
So question is, how hands-on are the film angels once they invest in a movie?
I think generally speaking, not just film angels, but any investor, it's kind of a scary thing when you have investors getting very involved in the creative process, right? Especially if it's not what they do. And I would say the same thing even from a startup perspective. I mean, there are sort of limits. There's guidance, advice, and then there's actually running the day-to-day operations, which unless we're asked to, I don't think is usually a good thing. Now, I can tell you there are people who do have a creative background, who may have a role beyond just executive producer or whatever credit they get at the end of this. But that's something that's agreed to sort of on a one-on-one basis, right? And it totally depends on who you're talking to from an investor perspective and also the help that the team needs at any given time.
I'll add to that basically, if you want a studio career eventually, you better be ready to have the financiers, i.e. the studios, be in your business every single day. I know filmmakers who have dropped off the studio map because they just couldn't take it. Studios are in your business. There are very few directors in Hollywood. One of them is a guy, David Fincher, produced The Social Network, who has complete creative control. But that you can count the number of directors who have that in one hand when you're talking about studio films. Everybody else is second class. More and more, yes. This seems to be like a recent trend. I feel like I've been asked that question a few times in the last 6 months. It's happening a lot. But yeah, the cross-platform stuff is becoming increasingly popular. Though, my own personal opinion is I think if you're doing too many things at once, it dilutes the value of, any one thing. So, my suggestion would be to focus on screenwriting if that's what you want to do instead of creating a massive brand, unless you're running a company or something like that.
Yeah, I've heard the term transmedia so much now. Look, I think it's actually a very cool opportunity, and I'll tell you why. So, traditionally we look at films as sort of the end product, the revenue stream, and when you start to layer on things like gaming and others, you offer the opportunity that you could change and flip that, right? So I've seen projects that actually think of theatrical or think of the film as actually marketing for the app, right, which is a paid app, and driving distribution from that perspective. And I think the good news is these platforms now exist. They didn't exist before. And I think it's in everyone's interest to at least think about what the opportunities are, what the IP that can be used across, whether it's merchandising, whether it's a new game, whether it's an app, etc. Because those rights can be valuable, and in fact, in some ways, I think those rights in some cases can be more valuable than the actual film product. Certainly, coordinating all these things is really, really hard, right? People who are really good at films can be horrible at games, can be horrible at apps. The challenge that I've had in the ones that I've seen is that you see the expertise for one and not the expertise for the other. But I've actually seen at least a couple projects now that I think are going to be turning this model upside down in a really interesting way and have really thought through all these pieces. And I think it'll even create new forms of storytelling, right, where you leak out bits of the story at different points across a different media. And like, The Dark Knight did this actually pretty well. So The Dark Knight, when they started, I don't know if you guys remember, there was like a heist scene that's happening. Well, for months before, there were a lot of people who were crowdsourced involved with the story up to that point. And so the film actually starts from there. And as an audience member, you just see it from that point on. But actually, there was a whole community of people who were involved with the film up to that point in terms of getting the story there, which is a great way to get people fired up, to think about, certainly for marketing for the film. I actually think of crowdsourced funding as another interesting mechanism to do some of these things too. Not so much funding, but distribution again, right? If I give you guys, if everybody in here had a share of the film that I was putting out, the one thing you can guarantee is you'll all show up to watch it and you'll all tell your friends. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that we can start to do with the multiple platforms and experimenting across them.
What are the elements of a good pitch for a filmmaker when they come to the Film Angels?
Question is, what are the elements of a good pitch for the Film Angels if you were to pitch to them?
I think the elements of a good pitch are the same elements you'd see if you saw a tech pitch startup or anything analogous, right? So it's certainly, on one hand, understanding the content, making a connection, hopefully, with the people in terms of the story that you're telling. But beyond that, I think it's also talking about distribution, talking about your audience, doing the market sizing stuff, sort of all the business components that I think are going to be important from the perspective of that an investor would care about from a return profile perspective, right? Certainly, a lot of it tends to come back to the actual backgrounds of the people involved. And convincing them that that you have all this experience around the table that will help to create a successful opportunity. But what's, I guess, again, been a difference that I see on both sides of this is that I will get, on the other hand, many pitches from filmmakers that are, somebody who is a passionate, creative individual who's got this, it's the equivalent of sort of the Bible, right, in terms of how important it is to them, and that is the pitch. And I think a lot of what we try to do is to get people to think beyond just the actual pitch being the script, and to think about all the other things that come along with that, the people, et cetera. Because I think, it's not a one-man or one-woman show. And thinking through the financing potential from an investor perspective, there's a lot of things that they're thinking about beyond just the script.
So the question is, once an investment is made in a film by the Film Angels, how much of a hand do you have in guaranteeing distribution, if at all?
So it's something that we've actually talked about a lot because, distribution can be the equivalent, in some cases actually, of like the early exit, right? It's like the small acquisition that Google makes for talent. It's an option. And people think about it differently. So there is actually a lot of discussion, and there's a lot of personal relationships with different distributors. But institutionalizing that has been something that hasn't happened yet. I do think it's actually critically important to even have distribution involved with possibly the front end of the conversation, so that they're watching the project from the beginning, and are almost vested in the process. I think is actually a good thing. Having said that, I think these days it's still very much ad hoc, and I think there's also, from a distribution outcome perspective, there's also different expectations from a filmmaker in terms of what's attractive for them. Is it just getting the film made? Is it sort of the return? Is it sort of selling off distribution rights very early on in the process and not really participating in the upside? Versus people who are like, no, we're going to absolutely hold on to control all the way through. We're involved in some of those discussions, but I think a lot of that is driven by the filmmakers.
This goes back, though, to, back to the Valley, creating original content. I mean, YouTube owns possibly the world's greatest distribution channel, period. Netflix owns one of the best distribution channels, right? And you see Netflix step up and start to produce original content. But why not some of these other places? I mean, they own the distribution. They can put it on the homepage, sell ads against it, and they're set.
Well, YouTube does, right? So YouTube raised the $100 million fund, right? And I've known a couple of filmmakers who've actually gone that process.
So non-crowdsourced, non-contest-like content, actually just building an in-house production team, hiring showrunners away from from the lot? Why not take it that far?
So there are startups now that are focused on just that, for instance. So I think we're at that point now where the definition of distributor, content creator, even what a network is in the context of television is totally getting changed. Check out a company called Maker Networks. Those guys effectively do a lot of the representation for a lot of the content guys who are big on YouTube, for instance, and have a whole production team behind them, and a syndication team and an advertising team to start to monetize those things outside the traditional system entirely. I think those things are happening, but the world always moves slower than you want. And as I said, the Valley is just starting to understand what this game is even like, which is a big step forward, but it, unfortunately, it happens at a glacial pace. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
You said once you sponsor a person, you decide to take him into your organization, you give him a larger audience.
Okay, so the question has to do with the process for the Film Angels. Once you enter into once you get sponsored, what happens from there?
Yeah, so I think the audience part of this, I think the reference was made to the fact that a larger audience of investors, right? That's the thinking. So like for instance, at our quarterly events, we'll often have 100 investors in the room, all with an intent, to buy, theoretically, and 5 projects that are essentially being showcased. And so the idea is you're having those living room conversations that you would, but you'd have 100 at a time. Now I can tell you that there's people actually certainly that we know, both in the Film Angels and otherwise, who have differing abilities to write checks. Some people have financed entire films themselves. Some people always syndicate and are a smaller piece. But the idea is take at least that part of the work out of it from a filmmaker perspective. And it's not just audience there. I think it's also connecting people. We try to find creative ways to get sort of the members and the filmmakers connected even outside of the physical meeting structure that we talked about.
So the question has to do with how successful the Film Angels are. I'll make a presumption, which is how's your ROI, or however you measure success.
I think we're still measuring, right? I think the jury's still out. We're still relatively young. It's about 3 years. Yeah, honestly, I don't know that I could give you the stats that you want specifically. You can certainly, if you're interested, I can put you in touch with someone who can give you the detailed breakdown there. I think the hope is that we're losing less money than everybody else who invests in film. But it's funny too, because a long time ago someone told me that the only way to lose more money than tech startups is to invest in films, and I was like, well, sign me up, right? But I think the hope is that the discipline that we're providing and some of the things that we're talking about that got touched on here lead to better outcomes. In fact, the guy who founded it, Thomas Trenker, he actually worked on he was an ex-banker. His PhD was actually on investing profitably in indie film, and he had all the regressions that could prove to you why, from a cash-on-cash perspective, you should be able to make good money. But the proof is in the pudding and in the track record, and I don't know that we have that yet.
So the question is, do the Film Angels invest in international productions or just domestic?
Yes. We've seen, I've actually seen everything. I just came back from Dubai and Egypt right now. We've seen projects from Iran. We've seen projects actually from that part of the Middle East. I have a project that I was involved with that actually was funded from the Qatari government. So there's no bias, I think, from that perspective in terms of where things can get funded from. Certainly, some places in Europe have a long history. I know a lot of German filmmakers, French filmmakers. There's a lot of history, but I think the point is that there isn't a bias from our perspective. For me personally, I actually prefer looking at projects that have an international component to them.
Sounds like you handle a lot of feature projects in TV, specifically series.
So the question is, outside of features, do you make any investments, specifically TV?
We've been pitched some TV projects and some production companies there. So it's certainly part of the mandate. I don't know, frankly, that one, it's been a very small minority of the projects that have come through, and I can't tell you that I remember one that got financed.
There's one last over there. Do you also work with nonfiction or fiction or anything like an educational film department, or is it mostly like fiction features that you're looking for return on?
So the question is, fiction, nonfiction, what kind of stuff do you look at? Documentary, educational?
Yes. So across the board, some of the more innovative things I've actually seen have been, new ways to create nonfiction. Documentaries, certainly, there's been a lot of different things that have come through. And, the Valley would lend itself really well to that too, right? If you have a documentary about clean tech or green tech, as an example, there's a lot of resources that you can pull to get stuff done. So I think there's leverage in a lot of those things, and we hope to see more.
All right, I think we're wrapping up. Thanks for having us.
Thank you,
And thanks, Saad, very much.
Likewise. Nice to meet you guys.